Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tracing the dramatic, completely world-altering timeline of Louis XVI. We're looking at a deeply reluctant leader, a man who was thrust into an impossible role at the helm of a nation literally on the brink of an explosive transformation. We're going to break down the exact cascade of events, the terrible decisions, and the absolute disasters that dismantled over 1,000 years of continuous French monarchy. Think about this chilling transition for a second. How exactly does a guy born to divine right, an absolute monarch of France and Navarre, find himself reduced to a common citizen, addressed just as Citoyen Louis Capet, waiting for his turn at the guillotine? It's a staggering fall from grace, and to really understand it, we've got to go back to the very beginning. Section 1. The Reluctant Boy King. To understand the monarch, you've really got to look at the boy, who seemed fundamentally ill-equipped for the brutal machine of the French monarchy. Young Louis Auguste was, well, he was a pretty shy kid. His genuine passions were deeply intellectual and solitary. He excelled in Latin, geography, astronomy. He even loved locksmithing. But he was about to face the crushing weight of inheriting a completely destitute national treasury and a public that was just exhausted from despotic rule. And to make matters worse, his instructors actually taught him that timidity was a valuable trait for a strong monarch and that he should never, ever let people read his mind. Talk about a recipe for disaster. And this quote right here perfectly captures his tragic flaw. When questioned about a policy decision early in his reign, Louis literally said, "It may be considered politically unwise, but it seems to me to be the general wish, and I want to be loved." He desperately, desperately wanted public affection. But he totally lacked the decisive firmness you need to govern a volatile, debt-ridden nation. It's like he was trying to be everyone's best friend in a system that demanded a tough leader willing to make the really hard choices. Section 2. War and Financial Ruin. All right, let's look at this staggering number. 1,066 million livres. That was the absolute cost of France's intervention in the American Revolutionary War. See, Louis saw an opportunity to humiliate Great Britain, so he secretly sent supplies and eventually signed a formal alliance. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. This massive war effort was financed entirely by new, high-interest international loans instead of just raising taxes. So the financial foundation of the entire country was essentially cracking under the weight. Now combine that massive hidden war debt with the reality on the ground, and the picture gets incredibly grim. By 1788, the royal household alone was sucking up 13% of the state's total expenses. Just imagine that. Imagine you're a starving French citizen, you're suffering through terrible harvest, bread prices are skyrocketing, and meanwhile, more than a tenth of the entire nation's wealth is being poured into the extravagant, luxurious lifestyle of the court at Versailles. You can definitely understand the boiling rage of the masses. So the king absolutely knew he was in deep trouble, but his advisors kind of just threw fuel on the fire. His finance minister, Jacques Necker, published misleading accounts that literally made the public think France was running a surplus. Crazy, right? When he was eventually ousted, his successor, Calonne, tried to recklessly spend the country's way out of debt. Obviously, both of those strategies failed miserably. Completely out of options and financially ruined, a desperate Louis was forced to convoke the Estates General. This was a representative assembly that hadn't even met in over 170 years, all just to try and force through some urgent fiscal reforms. Section 3. The Revolution Ignites. By calling the Estates General, Louis essentially handed his fate over to the people. And man, the rapid-fire escalation that followed was dizzying. In May 1789, the Estates General meets. By June, representatives of the commoners form the National Assembly and take the famous tennis court oath. By July, the Bastille is stormed. And by October, an angry mob of working men and women march right up to Versailles. Within just a few short months, the vast majority of the king's absolute executive authority was completely dismantled and transferred directly to the elected representatives of the nation. Following that October march, the royal family was physically forced by the crowd to leave the isolated, opulent bubble of Versailles and relocate to the Tuileries Palace, smack in the middle of Paris. The idea was that the king would be much more accountable if he actually lived among the people. But in reality, they were virtual prisoners. The principles of popular sovereignty had firmly taken root, and this was a decisive, physical break from the centuries-old idea of divine right. Moving on to Section 4, the flight to Varennes. Okay, so feeling completely trapped by this increasingly radical revolution, the king and queen hatch a desperate and ultimately fatal escape plan in June 1791. Let's look at the anatomy of this spectacular failure. First, Louis leaves a 16-page manifesto on his bed, basically complaining about the consequences of the revolution. Then, the family sneaks out of Paris in secret, hoping to reach a royalist fortress town. But Louis's constant indecision causes massive delays. And the ultimate irony here? He was recognized by a local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet. How? Drouet spotted the king's famous profile from a 50 livres paper assignat coin. Within 24 hours, the whole family was arrested in Varennes and dragged right back to Paris. The fallout from this botched escape was just catastrophic. Up until this exact moment, a lot of French people actually still viewed him as a good king who was just being led astray by bad advisors. But by trying to flee toward the Austrian border, which was his wife's homeland, by the way, he basically proved to the public that he completely rejected the revolution. It sparked widespread panic about a foreign invasion, permanently shattered public trust, and caused republicanism to literally burst out of the coffee houses and become the dominant political philosophy in France. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, End of a Dynasty. So the surrounding European monarchs were completely horrified by what was happening in France. In July 1792, the invading Prussian-Austrian army issued the Brunswick Manifesto. This explicitly threatened to destroy Paris by martial law if the royal family was harmed in any way. But ironically, a manifesto meant to protect the king did the exact opposite. To the revolutionaries, this was the final, undeniable proof that Louis was colluding with foreign enemies. The public anger just boiled over. A mob invaded the Tuileries Palace, and the monarchy was officially abolished. But the absolute nail in the coffin came a few months later in November. Authorities discovered the Armoire de Fer, this secret iron safe hidden right inside the king's bedroom. And guess who revealed it? Francois Gammain, the very locksmith who had installed it, and a guy the king genuinely trusted. Inside were deeply compromising documents and letters proving the king's covert resistance to the revolution. This evidence is what really sealed his fate. Let's see how this all builds to the climax. Louis is put on trial before the National Convention, facing heavy accusations of high treason and crimes against the state. He knew he was probably going to be killed, but he still mounted a defense, fighting to be remembered as a good king. 721 deputies were tasked with deciding his fate. What followed was a grueling, super intense 36-hour roll call vote to figure out his punishment. The outcome was agonizingly close. Out of 721 deputies, 361 voted for his immediate execution. That means Louis XVI was condemned to death by a razor-thin majority of a single vote. Even his own cousin, the former Duke of Orleans, voted for his execution. The decision was absolutely final. On January 21st, 1793, the deposed king was brought to the Place de la Révolution. Meeting his fate with this really unexpected dignity and bravery, the 38-year-old former monarch delivered a short speech. He declared his innocence and pardoned those who caused his death, right before his words were drowned out by a drum roll. He was beheaded by the guillotine, bringing an absolute bloody end to more than 1,000 years of continuous French monarchy. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. You've seen the data, the timeline, the staggering debt, and his really profound personal indecision. Based on the historical record, was this man a genuine tyrant who willfully oppressed his people? Or was he simply an unequipped boy, tragically crushed by the unstoppable, snowballing momentum of history? Let that sit with you as you consider the monumental legacy of the French Revolution. Thank you so much for learning with us today.